The street from us here is our final destination. Undoubtedly, this is my least favorite stop on tonight's tour. I really don't like coming to this last house for many, many reasons. For lack of anything else I could say, it's just a bad place. It's just a bad place to be. It doesn't even feel nice here. Now, this house doesn't really have a name either. It's usually just known by its street address, 432 Abercorn. Even then, a lot of people just call it that house. Many people want as little to do with this house across the street as possible, me included. Now, this house was built in 1868 for General Benjamin Wilson. Now, General Wilson was a former Confederate general, but by 1868, after the war, a very angry, very bitter man. He was very upset about the loss of the Confederacy, even more upset about the changes happening down here after the war. On top of it all, General Wilson's wife had recently died during one of the many yellow fever epidemics that hit Savannah. So he was a very angry, very bitter man. He lived in this house with his daughter and his servants, and that was all. Now, at the same time the Wilsons lived here, this school right across the street was in operation. That place used to be the Massey School, the oldest public school here in Georgia. Also, the oldest public school here to have been fully integrated since the day that it opened up in 1856. Before the war. So Savannah did have a history of racial harmony before a lot of other cities caught on. That spirit was not shared by somebody like General Wilson. This angry, nasty man. Every afternoon his daughter would be out in the middle of the square playing with the Massey school kids, black and white. And he used to tell his daughter day after day after day, you are not to be playing with those kids. He really tried to drill into his daughter's head this idea she and her family were far above the kinds of kids that went to the Massey school. But she didn't care. She was a little girl. What difference did it make to her what color her playmates were? But one afternoon, General Wilson decided he was going to teach his daughter a lesson. She was going to learn her social place, whether she wanted to or not. He didn't beat it into her or scold or anything like that. Instead, General Wilson took a straight-back wooden chair and he set it up in this far right-hand window on the main level of the house. And he waited for his daughter to come inside. And when she did, he took her to that chair, sat her down in the chair, and he tied her to the chair. And he gave the servants explicit instructions. He told them not to feed her, not to give her anything to drink, not to pay her any attention. He said she was to sit in that chair, look out over Calhoun Square, and she would see what it was she was not to do, and she would learn her lesson. And it was going to take as long as it needed to. That poor little girl sat in that chair for over 3 days, nothing but the hot sun beating down on her. Finally, a woman came walking down the street, and she happened to notice a little girl who didn't look too well sitting there in the window, tied to a chair. She alerted the authorities, but when the police came, they untied the little girl from the chair only to find she was long dead from sunstroke and heat exhaustion. General Wilson really didn't seem to care. Not a big deal, I guess. I suppose he figured it was better that than for her not to have learned her lesson. He didn't bat an eye, didn't shed a tear. Of course, people here in Savannah decided General Wilson was a celebrated war hero and one of Savannah's more prominent citizens. So why stir up trouble for the general? So he just went on living here as though this whole thing never happened. It seems like, just as with the Espy house across the street, one tragedy in the beginning has the potential to brand this house forever, turn it into a much, much darker place than it was ever meant to be. Let's check it out a little closer. Years later, in 1966, there was a family who was living here in this house, and they had 2 daughters. And they had some family friends come visit them from out of town, and they brought with them their 2 daughters. So between both families, there were 4 girls in this house in 1966. They were between the ages of 16 and 4. Now, one night the parents went out to dinner. They left the girls here alone by themselves. The 16-year-old girl was put in charge. The parents went out to eat. They came home. They went up these stairs, walked into the front door, into the front parlor. Lying on the parlor floor were 3 girls, arranged head to toe, head to toe, head to toe, in some strange triangular formation in the middle of the room. They were all lying on their backs, sprawled out in the middle of the parlor floor. All 3 of them had been gutted from the middle on up, their insides pulled out of their body and arranged in bloody bits around their mutilated corpses. There was blood smeared in one thick line across each of the parlor walls here, running all the way down to the floor, and just in a frenzy, in a panic, the parents ran upstairs and they found the youngest girl, 4 years old, the only one still alive. She was huddled in a corner in one of the upstairs bedrooms, holding onto herself, shivering and shaking, and they kept asking her, what happened, what happened? All she said was, I don't know. Later she told her parents she had been with her sister and her friends the whole time. She said nobody broke in, Nobody smashed the windows. Nobody broke down the door. She just truly did not know what had happened. In all the efforts to try and crack this case, no murder weapon was ever found or identified. We don't know how or with what these girls were killed, if someone did break in and kill them. No killer ever found, no culprits apprehended. The case more or less went cold and people just stopped caring. Maybe people didn't want to care. Maybe people wanted to push this as far out of their minds as they could. Now, the other idea is that maybe this wasn't the work of some Savannah Ripper or some serial axe murderer or something like that, but what if it was something else entirely? What if there really was something already inside the house? Something so truly awful, something truly, really demonic within this house, and that ultimately had been responsible for the deaths of these girls. I seem to think, considering where this house is and what has happened here before, that to me seems just as perhaps even more likely. Years later, in the 1990s, this place became apartments. It seems like that is the fate of a lot of these old Savannah houses. And there was a Savannah College of Art and Design student named Nathan, who often rode his bicycle around the square. Nathan admired this house. He said there was a strong energy here. Couldn't quite understand it, couldn't quite place it, but he knew this house was important. And one afternoon, Nathan's prayers were answered. He saw a for rent sign in the window. He broke his old lease and moved in. Nathan lived here for 3 years, really dug into the history of this house, wanted to know all he could about it. Nathan said while he was here, all sorts of weird people moved in and out. But this is the weirdest and most bizarre bunch of people. It was a group who moved in from California, who were renting the room opposite him. He said they were very reclusive. They didn't want anything to do with anyone outside their little group. They were exchanging manual labor to live in this house, so none of them had real jobs. So they got up to all kinds of weird things during the middle of the night. Nathan was always very curious. Sometimes he was a little too curious for his own good. He started snooping around. Come to find out, this group of people had actually been sent by Anton LaVey in San Francisco. They were looking to found a new Church of Satan here in Savannah. This was the building they picked. This was where they were worshiping out of. In fact, I kid you not, the black pentagram they painted on the floor of their room is still intact in one of the upstairs bedrooms of this house. And so, perhaps it was just bad luck on Nathan's part. His curiosity with this house coincided with the Satanism that was taking place. But certainly that's some energy, that's some juju no one should mess around with. After a while, Nathan's curiosity started to really get the better of him. He was sick and tired of reading books and newspaper articles. He was sick and tired of dry information. He wanted something juicier. So he figured, why not start messing around with seances and Ouija boards inside this house? I don't know if anybody here has toyed around with things like Ouija boards before. Oftentimes we do when we're younger and more naive. If you have not, then certainly you are wiser than I. But a Ouija board is just a tool. Like any tool, it can be abused or misused. It's more like a radio tower, sending out a broadcast to anything out there in the realm of the paranormal. You can't decide what you're going to get in touch with, though. You can't decide who's going to tune into that broadcast. You're just opening up a door, letting whatever is out there get at you, good or bad. And that might have been the problem that Nathan and his friends ran into. Because one night after a seance, after a Ouija board session inside this house, Nathan said goodnight to his friends and fellow housemates, seemingly went to bed. In the morning, he was never seen or heard from again. This was 1995. Here it is 2012. Last I heard, his family was still looking for him. He just disappeared, simply vanished. That was it. Here it is, going on 20 years later, and I still have no idea where he is. Perhaps unfortunately for Nathan, oftentimes we can't decide if, when we're done with our little Ouija board session, we can't decide if whatever it is we've gotten in touch with is done with us. Maybe he should have thought about that. His friends had to break into his room the next day. Everything was still just as he had left it. Wallet, shoes, clothes, bags, books. Stood where you are standing right now, took one look at this house, and refunded the money they were offered to investigate outright. They wanted nothing to do with this house. But after a long search, finally they got a hold of this pretty prominent Native American paranormal investigator, a guy named Jason. And Jason was so famous in his field at the time because Jason used to believe there was no such thing as evil. He thought everything of a paranormal or supernatural nature was just a manifestation of human nature. It was all human energy. If that was the case, nothing could really be bad or evil. They figured if anyone could crack this house, it would be him. So they brought Jason here. He set one hand on the railing, one foot on the stairs, took one look up at this house in sheer horror and disgust. To this day, Jason has not conducted another paranormal investigation. After seeing this house, he was done. He said this house proved him wrong. Evil really did exist. Jason had been all over the world. Places that were taboo that nobody would touch, Jason had no problem delving right into. But here, he just couldn't do it. He said in his vision, when he looked at this house, he could see a thick black stripe running up and down the middle. He called it a death column. He said in the windows, he could see faces, dozens of faces staring back at him, screaming. He said they were the faces of all those drawn in, sucked in, destroyed for this house, and kept here by some awful, terrible, malevolent presence, just unable to leave. But he said rather poetically, this house had the mark of the devil like no place he had ever seen before in his life. Now the current owner of this house you will never, ever see. She doesn't live here. She actually lives up in New York City. She just owns this house and lets it sit here just like this. There are lights on, they're electronically timed, they turn on and off at certain hours. They're simply to deter us from having anything to do with this house. The woman who owns this place doesn't want anyone to approach it or go near it or do anything with it. She wants it to stay just as it is. There is a caretaker who will sometimes come here and cut the grass and collect the mail, but that's it. Nothing really happens here. You can even see where there's peeling, mildewy wallpaper up there. Did you ever consider selling that house you own in Savannah? She responded. The only time she's ever had anything to say about this house, she told the paper, "Why would I inflict that curse on anyone else?" That's all she said. That was it, nothing more. I guess that's opened up an even wider mystery. Who is she? Why does she own this house from so far away and just let it sit here like this? You know, what's her deal? Why is she guarding us from it? What does she know that we don't? I did hear that she was the 4-year-old girl who survived in 1966. And maybe she's still holding on to this house, trying to ensure that what has happened here before will never, ever happen again. Maybe. Seems likely. Seems logical. I don't know her personally, so I can't prove that to you one way or the other. But the last thing that I'm going to say about this house, I don't say to frighten you for fear's sake, or just to scare you to be a gimmick. That would all be silly. But the last thing I say here, I mean in all due honesty. Now this is quite possibly the most serious thing I have said all night. This is the only place I have ever borne witness to something having followed someone home from. That does happen and can happen. A lot of people will tell you that can't happen. That's just to make you feel better. It does happen, and it did. I used to think that it didn't happen and couldn't happen. Of course, I was wrong. I was a fool. I used to be so stupid as to bring two groups right up onto this front sidewalk here, right in front of this house, just feet away from it. I don't do this anymore, this being the reason why. Or maybe you can see some of the bricks up along the sidewalk look like they're loose and kind of crumbling out of alignment there. I had a tour group with me. I was also in the process of training another tour guide. So we were all standing up there in front of the house. This tour guide trainee had been with me maybe 4 or 5 nights so far. So we'd heard these stories a few times. Maybe by the time we got here that night, he was a little bored. He heard these stories one too many times. He was restless. So as I was going on about this house's history, out of tedium, out of boredom, he just kicked one of those loose bricks loose with his foot, just knocked it out of place. But he said as soon as he did that, as soon as he knocked this brick out of its alignment, he got this gut-wrenching sensation that something here inside this house wanted him to know that he should not have done that. He said there was something here within this house that spoke to him, that told him to leave this place alone, that nothing was supposed to change here. He said he had altered the balance of things, and something wanted him to know that it was not going to end well. This was very weird for me to hear coming from him. This guy was more of a skeptic than anyone that I knew. He was taking the job as tour guide because it was a job, and that was all. He started to feel dizzy and lightheaded and nauseous. He had to leave the tour group, and he came and sat down out here in the square, and he couldn't even stand up. He was dry heaving, nearly sick. Afterwards, we all went back to Clary's, and the tour was over. But before he got into his car, he came over to me and he said something was on him. He said something had attached itself to him. He could feel it. And he said he was terrified. I didn't know what to say to him. He went home that night. He had these awful dreams that would wake him up. He said each time he would wake up, he'd be dripping in a cold sweat, and he would see these shadows dancing on the wall across from him there in bed. This went on for weeks and weeks and weeks. These nightmares seemed to get worse and worse. These shadows came closer and closer each night, until finally it all came together. He said, one night, after the worst dream he'd had yet, he sat bolt upright in his bed, and he stopped breathing because of something he saw standing there at the very foot of his bed. He said standing there at the edge of his bed was this tall, dark, shadowy, human-like figure. Much taller, he said. Much thinner than a normal person, but even then, he said he had the good sense to know it was not human, whatever it was. This shadow figure, he said, was looming down over him, staring at him. He said he knew with every ounce of his being, whatever it was, it had come from this house for him. He said this is what had attached itself to him, and it had just been waiting. He said whatever it was, it reached out as if to touch him, and he suddenly felt ice cold, numb all over. He didn't remember what happened after that. Afterwards, he tried to go through a number of means to get rid of it. He even tried coming back here and putting the loose brick back in place. But I think it was too little too late. Whatever it was didn't really want to be gotten rid of. Now, he's still in Savannah, this would-be tour guide, last I knew. Certainly he is not a tour guide, and certainly he is not the same person. He has changed. For the worse. I certainly do not know who he is anymore. It seemed like in the beginning, whatever this thing was didn't want to leave him, but towards the end, he had grown at one with it. He didn't even want whatever it was to be gotten rid of himself. He was right. It seemed like an attachment. But he was a host for it. I couldn't say whether he became it or it became him, but it was all very gradual and it was all very frightening. He really did, honest to God, change. He even looked different. And I don't know what this all was. Was it a true possession? Was it a true demonic possession? I ask myself that even now. Maybe, I don't know. I will probably never know. But I think, at the least, it seems to have been a very strong attachment. This house should be a lesson for us. We should learn from it. As fascinating as the realm of the paranormal often is, sometimes the best bet, ultimately, is just to look at it, hear about it, admire it from afar, but at the end of the night, we better damn well walk away from it.